Bonjour, bonjour, and welcome to this evening's webinar. We're so grateful and elated and happy to have you here with us this evening. I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation because we're going to be talking all things inflammation. We're going to really dive down into what exactly does that word mean, because you hear it tossed around so often. I'd argue it's lost some meaning. And then we're going to speak to, once we understand what inflammation is, what might be causing it, what exactly can we do about it? So welcome this evening, our wonderful hosts. I have Justin, one of our most acclaimed health coaches here at the DNA Company. And additional to that, I have Dr. Stephanie Nielsen, our most beloved PharmD, who champions all things pharmaceutical and natural medicine. And I'm just elated to jump into this conversation with you guys. Before we go there, our audience, there is a poll. Please do fill it out. We want to know who you are. We want to know why you're here. Once we've started pulled back the curtains on what inflammation is, we're going to check that poll, understand what sorts of inflammation you have, and then we're going to work on solving them. So, guests, Dr. Nielsen, Justin, wrap with me for a little bit. What exactly is inflammation? When someone comes into your practice and says, I'm inflamed, what do they think they mean, and what do you think they mean?
I'll start here just because it's so prevalent and it's really something that I encounter pretty much on a day-to-day basis. When
Mhm.
people come in and they say that they have some sort of inflammatory thing going on, it's kind of funny. I've noticed they often want to start it as a process of addition. They want to add an anti-inflammatory strategy. And I always
Mm,
come at it as it's more of a process of deletion, I think, in the beginning.
mm,
Like you need to find what's causing it in the first place. Obviously, we look to the genes for such a thing, but it's like we have this element of trying to be a little bit more proactive than reactive in our practice at the DNA Co. It's like if something is inflamed, well, that means it's on fire. So,
mm,
yes, you should put some attention into putting the fire out, but you should also ask yourself who lit the match in the first place. So you can
mm,
find the guy and slap him around a little bit. You know what I mean? Get him to stop. So we look at the genes in order to kind of find the areas that your body is getting these internally created inflammatory factors, or where
mm,
your body is just not detoxifying and it's causing additional inflammation. Inflammation is a very important process in the body, right?
mm,
So if you were to get, let's say, stung by a bee, well, the area is going to swell up with water because it quarantines the poison, and that helps to alleviate the issue. But we've turned an acute response into a chronic response by adding in all manner of inflammatory factors,
mm,
Wi-Fi and toxins in the water and toxins in the air. We could wax poetic about that for a while, I'm sure, but I think that's what's really happened. And the
mm.
more that the body deals with chronic inflammation, the more of a longevity consequence there is to it. So we really try to kind of work backwards and get rid of that. Dr. Nielsen, I mean, I'm sure that you see this all the time. If you guys don't know, she's a wonderful specialist with BHRT and obviously functional genomics practitioner extraordinaire. Oh, you're
Oh,
muted
you're
there.
so close. You're muted. So close.
So close, sorry. I think the thing when most of my clients come in and say, I've got inflammation, they think of their aches and pains, the things
Mm,
that they come in and go, oh, my back, oh, my
mhm,
neck, oh, my fingers, oh, my feet. And what I think the thing that we forget about inflammation is there's often a lot of silent inflammation. And
mm,
that's something that we see on a cellular level. That's something that we can see on blood tests or in cell cultures like a pap smear. It
mhm,
is that subclinical inflammation that's going to lead us toward a path when there's more frank inflammation. So when we can catch inflammation early or prevent or reduce inflammation, then we get far better outcomes. And yes, there's not anybody that I see on a daily basis that doesn't come in and say, my get up and go is gone. Or, oh, if my back was what it was like when I was 20 years younger. And so I think a lot of people think that inflammation has to be part of our life, but
mm,
it doesn't. And there
mhm,
are ways to reduce inflammation, to address inflammation, to be aware of inflammation that is way more powerful and hopefully by the end of tonight's webinar, you'll get some new strategies for how do I address inflammation, how do I recognize inflammation, and what can we do to keep it at bay or only when we need it at the most.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think Justin pointed out something really strong and beautiful is that inflammation serves a purpose. To an extent, it's a signal from our body saying, hey, something's wrong. There's a fire, we need to address it. Right? When you see a fire, it's a panic moment. You throw your body, quite literally, through the immune system, throws a bunch of things at that. But if it gets to a point where that message is continuing, you're not addressing it, that's when the inflammation becomes chronic. And that's when it's saying the body is almost navigating, okay, so we know there's a fire, let's contain it. We know that that fire is going to cause damage. We're actually going to stop listening to it to an extent because it's always ringing this alarm. And think about yourselves, right? If you hear the exact same over and over again, eventually you stop listening. Eventually you habituate to it. And that's where a lot of the damage of chronic inflammation can come from. And I would also offer the confusion of it, right? There's many different things that can create that fire within the body, which is why inflammation is kind of this term that's tossed around and applied to almost everything to an extent, rightly so, and then to a detriment in the sense that it's too generously offered, right? Do you guys agree?
Mm-hmm.
I agree. And it's, the symptomology can be so varied with it,
Yeah.
right? Like for some people, it could manifest as like a skin problem. And for other people, it's more of a achy joints, to Dr.
Yeah.
Stephanie's point. And I think it's really important to remember that symptoms are the manifestation of the problem, but they're not the problem itself.
Right.
And I think,
Mm.
when it comes to mainstream medical's, approach to this, it's like, oh, take an NSAID, or something, take some sort of something to acutely
Hmm.
deal with the inflammation. But it's like, we do have to look upstream and understand, why is this inflammation process gotten out of our control,
Yeah.
right? And we have to put strategies and interventions in place at the root of that. And that's what's going to stop the downstream manifestation as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that's kind of why the solution to inflammation is not, to Justin's point, add things. It's not just take turmeric instead of an NSAID. It's truly understanding what is causing that fire. And I think that's, in my opinion, at least, a power of genetics insofar as we know the body's weak points. We know possibly where this fire might start, what might be causing it, right? Both from the DNA 360 that kind of peers into function of the body, and then separately, as we'll discuss later tonight, from tests like DNA-aging, where you're looking at that epigenetic kind of marking of where is stress sitting within the body. Yeah, so I wonder, powers that be, if you wouldn't mind just popping up our poll, because I think before we start digging more into causes of inflammation solutions, let's understand what people are here and hoping to hear from us. So the first question we asked was, which of these symptoms of inflammation have you experienced recently? And you got to pick as many as you want. And goodness, audience, there's some aches and pains in the body. So about half our audience here is showing up with some persistent fatigue and low energy. Okay. Oh, mon Dieu, 62% of our audience, Dr. Steph, you nailed it on the head. Joint pain or stiffness. You nailed it on. You always do, but I want to call you out when you do. 45% are saying they're struggling with digestion. So there's discomfort and there's bloating. So there's a bit more of a localized inflammation there. 26% skin issues, rashes, acne, eczema, things of that nature. And we have a solid 12% saying other. I'd love for you to toss in the chat what other is. I'm curious, but also want to make sure that we speak to it as well so that you're heard and seen here.
We have
And
lots of other coming in our Q&A.
oh,
So
do we?
yeah, we do.
Excellent. I
Yeah.
love it. Thank you. The next question we asked is, what steps have you taken to manage it? And I love our audience. Our audience is so proactive. So 80% have adjusted their diet, top notch. That's often the hardest one to think through. 50% have started or increased physical activity. Good source of inflammation, as Justin often preaches, and I love that. 80% have incorporated supplements. 50% have incorporated stress reduction. And then a solid 3%, an honest 3%, I value you, have said they don't make any changes. All right. the second last question that we have here is, have you ever undergone any testing to identify inflammation? So 60% of our audience have done some genetic testing. 50%, Dr. Nielsen, to what you were saying, have done some blood tests to actually confirm the current presence of. 36% have done other sorts. So for example, food sensitivity testing. Um, and then 10% have done some additional epigenetic testing. And then 20% have done nothing. So we'll make sure we talk through different ways that you can assess and really pinpoint the inflammation within your body. All right. Next, how much are you actually feeling it? And this question hurts me a little bit because between significantly and moderately, 70%, almost 80% of our audience is saying they feel it significantly or moderately. Yeah. Yeah. So this is an incredible pain point within
Did
everyone.
you hear how you said it hurts me to hear this? I don't know if you even knew that you were, but it's like it does hurt. And a lot of people don't even know how much they're hurting until they reverse it. And all of a sudden they're not hurting. And
Yeah.
that's when they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I could feel this good again. So
Yeah.
there is inflammation is rampant in,
Yeah.
our community.
Yeah. And I think it's that protective layer, right? Like you habituate to it, you get used to it, where the pain you almost accommodate becomes background and you forget that it's pain. Yeah. The last question that we have here is asking people if they know where their inflammation is coming from. And to me, this is an interesting one because it's almost the least answered question. So 10% are saying maybe hormones, 20% are saying food, 30%, a very typical percentage, is saying stress, right? And then there's a quarter here that are saying other. If you know where this inflammation is coming from, again, please toss it into the chat. And I'm seeing some responses here that some people are experiencing inflammation in relation to weight gain. And I would imagine that also fulfills, it's a self-fulfilling cycle there if you're adding weight, adding to that inflammation. Yeah. And then other people just don't know. Yeah.
I
Well, the
think a
weight
few
is the chicken or
people,
the egg thing, right? Sorry, Dr. Steph.
oh, no,
Um,
go for it.
yeah, so weight gain, that's kind of a chicken or the egg though, right? Because
Yeah.
is the inflammation causing the weight gain or is the weight gain causing the inflammation? Perhaps it's a combo of both. I think that last question there is very interesting because we've got hormones, we've got diet, all these different kind of categories, and you could have a trickle of inflammation coming from each of these areas.
Mm.
Right. And that's where the DNA 360 is a pretty useful tool because we can understand, toxic estrogen metabolites and methylation cycle, vitamin D profile. Like there could be a little element of each one of them causing the totality of the inflammation. I think it's really rare that there's ever one source of inflammation. I don't know if you girls would agree with that. You doctors who are brilliant, not you girls, but
We are girls too.
both.
We're both. Appreciate it though.
Well, and I really value that a lot of insight from some of our participants tonight are saying, hey, what about infections like Lyme, like
Yeah.
mold? At one place a lot of people don't think about is scarring. If you've had surgeries or multiple surgeries, scars can be a source of inflammation, the area around it, even as the body continues to try to heal,
Yeah.
or if you've had implants of some kind, whether it's a knee replacement or a button, or you've had screws, can often be implant area inflammation with scar tissue and stuff. So there are a lot of sources, but I love it that our audience was saying, hey, what about, have you thought about, or you didn't mention, here's my other. And
Yeah.
a lot of those are infective processes.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I heard you, it wasn't necessarily something inflammation wasn't initially root cause, but then it became a separate and additional cause that needs to be addressed alongside whatever the surgery and the healing was.
Sure.
Yeah. So how do each of you, and Dr. Nielsen, I'll start with you because I know you're a huge fan and advocate of blood work to do this sort of assessment. How do you go about assessing people's inflammation? So someone comes in, they say, hey, I'm achy all over. How do you go about starting that assessment?
So the first thing that I always do is I say, let's look at your lifestyle. We look, what does a 24-hour lifestyle of you look like? What does 3 to 4 days of your food and diet journal? And I always say, good, bad, or ugly. I don't care what it is. I just want to know what's real, because then we know what we're working with. I will tell you 95% of the people, when they give me both their lifestyle and their food journal, say, now this isn't typical. There was an exception this week. Or this is, I'm not always this bad. And what I want to tell them is no judgment, but did this open your eyes? Did you see something that you didn't see before? Like how much soda, how much sugar, how much packaged food, how much alcohol, how much caffeine, because all of those together can be pro-inflammatory for the body, or, when you have people that are just like, yeah, but I'm like, well, you didn't come here for yeah, but you came here for a new sense of where do we go. So besides looking at that lifestyle, how are they sleeping? Where are the areas that they're addressing to do their sleep hygiene? And then I really like to look at a comprehensive metabolic panel, and I like to look at a CBC with differential. I like to see what those white blood cells are all looking at, and how they're broken down. And can I see parasites in there? Can I see viruses? Can I see inflammatory reactions like with the eosinophils and the basophils, so that maybe there's a hidden food allergy? So when I've got a fresh set of a comprehensive metabolic or a total wellness panel, and when I've got a CBC on top of a lifestyle, then we can start working and digging in.
Yeah. And so Justin, give some commentary there to what Dr. Steph said, because you're so brilliant at this in supporting people being honest about their responses to their diet and lifestyle. Because I don't know, I thought it was Steph, I thought it might have been you, but someone sent me a study, and it was effectively, you made the comment of everyone comes back and says, this diet diary isn't a typical day.
Yeah.
And the study said that almost 100% of people say that, and maybe 20% are actually truthful in that, like it was sincerely an off day, but most people, 80% of people, it's actually true. So Justin, how do you do that reckoning? How do people bring that? Because if that's the source of inflammation that they're just not grasping.
Yeah, and that, I'll say first of all, health coaching needs to be a 100% judgment-free zone. If we're not operating through honesty, then we're never going to get results. If you tell me you're following the game plan and you're just not, I got nothing else to help you with. You have to follow the game plan. I really am a fan of, Dr. Stephanie's approach there, as far as lifestyle being the lowest hanging fruit possible. I like to say, you lived yourself into this situation, and we're going to live you out of it as well. My approach, and I've talked about this a couple times on the webinars because it's really relevant. I talk about this concept of moving from general to specific, right? Where I think that a lot of practitioners tend to start specific and maybe not even get to the general, right? So I'll use an example here. I had a client, he was certain he had low testosterone, and he just, sex drive was a problem for him. And he's asking me all these questions about testosterone boosting ingredients. But through my extrapolation and my interrogation process is what it ended up being, he vapes and he stays up late playing video games. And I explained, every 20 minutes of your life, you're heating up vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol and flavors and nicotine, and you're taking massive concentrated breaths of something your body can only interpret as being absolutely poisonous. Why would your body want you to procreate, right, and create children in an environment that's massively toxic? Your body only knows the signals that you actually give it. And he's talking about some $120 testosterone booster, which could in and of itself be a great later strategy. But I said, we have to start general and then move to specific. Dude, stop with the vaping. These things are killing your natural sex hormones, and I explain why. So I start with what's obvious. I ask them all these things about their lifestyle, their diet, etc. And exactly what I said in the beginning of the call, it's a process of deletion, then it's a process of addition. right? I think that using lab work is absolutely great, because if you want to know what's going on in your body, look, right? We have the capacity to do that now. So using a successful combination of things like our DNA aging test, for example, right, which shows you your methylation patterns, what genes are being expressed, which ones are being rendered dormant, and then zooming out and using the DNA 360 to kind of see where the source of it all would be coming from, identifying genetic weak points. You put it all together, and then you put a nice little game plan there, and they live themselves back into an anti-inflammatory state with all that knowledge.
Yeah. I love that lifestyle medicine can be such the foundation for things. And then genetics, especially after that has been addressed, can then be that additional layer of like, how do we go about preventing, ideally? But if the fix still isn't found, what do we know are weak points within the body that we can then start working atop? Yeah, because I mean, we all agree the science we do is sexy, right? Genes are sexy, they're fun, they're the new thing. But almost always, I know between the three of us, we always start diet and lifestyle, right? Regardless, the newfangled gadget, it's always going to come down to food, rest, and play to a certain extent.
Well, and I think another thing that people don't realize is how critical it is to understand water. Your water that you're drinking, the water that you're cooking with, the water that you're bathing in. I can tell you, you can go to environmental work group and you can put in tap water database. I have 20 total contaminants in our tap water, and 9 of them exceed health standards. And when you go down and look at it, it says bromodichloromethane, 106 times higher than the environmental work group guidelines, which would be 0.06. And this is 6.35. And it's like, wait a minute, you don't even, I've got chromium, I've got chloroform. Chloroform is a toxin. I've got haloacidic acids, all of these things. And you're like, well, I'll just go get a glass of water, or I'll just bathe for 20 minutes, or I'll soak in a deep soaky tub. So to look at, as Justin said, let's start with the obvious, which is how bad is my water? How bad is my food? How bad is my lifestyle? And then what can I do? Even small little changes can make a huge difference for your body. Whether it's just a filter for the water you're drinking, maybe it's re-adding your electrolytes and healthy balance of electrolytes so that you can actually hydrate. People say, I drink water all day, I can't imagine that I'm dehydrated. But do you have electrolytes in there to remineralize your body? Because all the sugar and the toxin and the vaping is leaching all those out. So how are you repleting your body instead of depleting it?
No, and it's hearing that sort of thing. But I'm looking in the chat, right? And we're asking people sources of inflammation, and the other, that we requested, it's some pretty complex things. Some people are saying endometriosis, some people are saying heavy metals, like there's some pretty rough things. And it's such, it can feel sometimes overwhelming as a person, especially as a sick person, to be like, cool, I have to treat not only this condition, but then kind of all address these foundational things, right? How do you guys suggest someone start, right? If there's a condition like endometriosis, for example, right, that in and of itself will create some inflammation, how do you suggest kind of starting with lifestyle stuff and additional, keeping in mind that condition that they're supposed to be treating? How do we stop them from boiling the ocean, instead just taking one cup before them?
There's this concept in Stoicism that really talks about controlling what you can control and sort of dropping the rest, because that in and of itself is toxic, right? That worry, that trying to, boil the ocean in and of itself, that's a source of stress, which can in and of itself totally deplete the HPA axis and your own body's internal reserves to deal with that. You can actually add inflammation just from the stress alone of these kinds of things. So identify all the things that you control, right? I have this thing that I do in my coaching where I tell my clients, take all these variables in your life and put them into 2 buckets. The first bucket is labeled things I control. The second bucket is labeled things I do not control. We're going to take that second bucket and we're going to throw it away, and we're going to divert 100% of our efforts, our energy, our thoughts into that first bucket. That's where it can do the most good. So look at your skincare products. You know what I mean? Everybody buys a soap. Well, which one is it? Is it got toxins in there, or is it natural? Everybody buys toothpaste. Does it have fluoride and garbage in there, or is it natural? Everybody uses cell phones. It takes a little bit of work to just add some sort of a Wi-Fi, disrupting device on there. And slowly you kind of piece it together and understand that it's the cumulative effect of all of these inputs that's causing your body the overload, right? Our ancestors didn't have massive inflammation problems because we've added so many different elements into it. So to Dr. Stephanie's point, a water filter, you can get those relatively cheap, then remineralize it. Some good sea salts. I can go on Amazon right now and buy Redmond Real salts for $11.99. And it's this big and it lasts me a long time. Right. So I don't suggest.
And those are Canadian dollars.
Yeah. So it's probably, $8.99 American or so.
$8.95 on special today, blue light.
Yeah, that stress of finances, by the way, being Canadian, causes me inflammation. So I don't want to think about that too hard. But yeah, control what you control. You can control a lot of things about your environment. A little air filter here, a little breathing practice there. All of it adds to you. And this is a process of addition once we get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Nielsen, do you have any other thing to add to that?
Well, for a woman, particularly with endometriosis, we've got to have the blood work done for your hormones, and we've got to then help either supplement or balance them out, because you're out of balance and you're in a growth or proliferation phase. So we've got to look at what your estrogen's doing. We've got to have a counterbalance to that proliferation. Maybe we need to clean your liver. Maybe we need to get some DIM on you. Maybe we need some calcium D-glucarate. How are you methylating? How are you glucurating? I mean, I say this, and it's the Asian nation, whether it's perspiration, respiration, glucuronidation, oxidation, sulfation, methylation. We've got to make sure all those pathways, those detox pathways, are working, are open, and then are in balance. When you grow a tumor, when you grow cancer, when you grow tissue like endometriosis, which is intrauterine tissue that's growing on the outside, all of those are impacted by that HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary axis, and a certain balance of your hormones. When we know you're a grower, okay, then we've got to knock down what is causing the growing. And I can tell you, I've had patients who've had 4 different kinds of cancer. And we said, well, we know you're good at growing stuff. So let's identify where in your body, where in your DNA, where in your lifestyle, you're augmenting that go button rather than the stop button. And so we look at, just like you were talking about, let's look at the things that we can control, which are food, lifestyle, diet. Even if you make one change, and one change is you go, oh, I'm just going to start adding some electrolytes. I'm going to add some Redmond sea salt. Maybe I'm going to add some potassium chloride or some magnesium malate to my water. I drink. I was, for years, my doctors always say, you look a little dehydrated. You look a little dehydrated. And, I would do the little skin test on my hand and, do this. And it still bounced back great. I'm like, I'm not dehydrated, until I did a hair tissue mineral analysis. And I found that my hair tissue minerals were bottom of the barrel, because I was drinking so much water that was empty, and I was leaching all those minerals out. And it was like, wow, even as much as I know, I missed this whole section about not repleting my body. So I don't love Gatorade. I don't love Powerade with all the colors and the flavorings. So I just drink plain old water with electrolytes in it. I add potassium chloride. I add magnesium malate. I add a Celtic sea salt. I rotate, and I do rotate my salts. I stay away from a lot of the Himalayan because that's iron. And the pink is iron, and I have enough iron, so I'm not iron deficient. But if you're iron deficient, you can look at that. So those are things that you can do. It's like, if you do that one thing, then when that you've got control from there, you can take the next step and you can start to see, oh my gosh, you get your blood work done and all of a sudden your practitioner goes, oh, you don't look dehydrated anymore. Great. What'd you do? Simple.
Yeah.
I added a couple little teaspoons of salt to my water.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to, before we kind of dig deeper into maybe questions or, other forms of testing of inflammation, I want to pause. And I asked a question, and Justin, through his very action-oriented, how do we address lifestyle in the most impactful way, gave an answer. And then separately, Steph, through her doctor lens, through her testing lens, through her hormone lens, gave a different answer of, you need a medical record, you need to do this test, you need to do that. And so I really want to showcase this as an example of, especially if you're someone managing just general chronic inflammation plus a condition, right? Really focus on who you're bringing into your healthcare team, because I will promise you, often it's not going to sit with one person. Usually it will be a collaborative effort between different minds, different experts, right? And ensuring that you trust and have good rapport with those people. Because I think, as Justin said, as Steph has said, right? There's an element of, they're going to call you out on some things that you weren't aware of. They're going to call you out on blind spots, and you need to know you have a good rapport with them and trust with them. You need to know what they're talking about. And I think working with qualified, compassionate practitioners is possibly one of the best things that you can start to do, right? Don't expect it to necessarily just be one person. You saw the collaboration here, right? And be mindful it's going to be a combination of lifestyle, applied lifestyle, and separate to that, let's establish that medical record. Let's pick those appropriate medical interventions atop that.
Yeah, I like to call that having a master plan and then mastering the plan.
Yeah.
Right? Like you need to use, all the brilliance of a practitioner to actually look at the problem and get a really good
Yeah.
plan. We have these programs that we do at the DNA company where we have what we call audits, and then it transitions to the coaching kind of phase. When I'm doing the audits, I'm creating the master plan. And then when we transition to the coaching, we are now mastering the plan. A lot of people have a problem with that. They can't master any plan. And it's like, well, even if, right, it's like either the plan sucks and you implemented it and that's why we failed, or the plan was good and you didn't implement it and that's why we failed. A successful marriage of both of those elements is how we get where we're going.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find that brilliance is sometimes one person, but sometimes a team, especially for more complex conditions. Yeah. So I think maybe before we transition into other questions, or at least the question and answer, because I see the Q&A box filling up quite happily. Um, Dr. Steph, Justin, any other things that you would use, especially in more of a medical context, if you have more of a complex kind of general inflammation, chronic inflammation, based off of that lifestyle survey, what other tests are you going to? Because like one of my emerging favorite tests is methylation testing. So namely, this is for, I think, Dr. Nielsen has already iterated through different serum or blood work measures that can assess for inflammation within the body. And we're starting to see an emergence of epigenetic testing, which is able to help further refine that. So a high HSCRP indicates you have high levels of inflammation. It doesn't necessarily indicate where that's coming from. And we're starting to see some methylation testing, which is able to give us that specificity, which is actually able to say, yes, you're inflamed, and it's very specific to metabolics, i.e. your diet, or it's very specific to your environment. You're carrying a high load of, or maybe it's your immune system. You're really struggling. You're overactive, you're underactive. So that has become one of my favorite places with which you can test for kind of that general nondescript. Any other thoughts or any other medical tests that you guys are thinking through?
I'll start on that just because I really, really think that this epigenetic testing thing is the other side of what we do with the DNA 360. I'll put on another hat for a second here just because we are running an offer for the holidays. If you
Oh,
do buy, sorry, I got to do it.
love
Um, if
it.
you buy more than one, like two or more tests, basically, you get 15% off for the holidays as well. So you could do the DNA 360 as well as the DNA aging, for example, and that gives you such a great screenshot of what's actually going on in your body, right? So your DNA would be the hardware. That's what you're born with. That's something that you can't change. How it's expressing is epigenetics, and that's the software, right? So that can be changed and modified via your lifestyle behaviors. So when you look at the methylation patterns in your body, when something becomes methylated, it actually gets turned off, right? So its expression gets shut down. But if it remains unmethylated, its expression is now on. So you can actually test that via just a few drops of blood, and you can see what genes are on average being turned on and what genes are on average remaining dormant. And that has massive trickle down effect to things like C-reactor protein, interleukin 6, these inflammatory markers. So you can really get a way better understanding of it. And what's cool is the company that we work with actually has one called the Dunedin Pace, which is really responsive to like recently added interventions, right? So it's not just about the history of your body's aging, but it's actually like if you added in a carbon 60 supplement or something 12 weeks ago, and you're hoping that it's lowering your CRP, well, you'll be able to see that correlation within your epigenetics. It's actually already taken place. So the Dunedin pace would actually show that. And it's a really cool thing. So we can bounce it off what your baseline template is from the DNA 360, then see how it's methylating and how it's actually turning up in your body. It's pretty cool. That's it. That was my rant.
No big deal. Just genetics. They're great.
Yeah.
Dr. Nielsen, any other thoughts from you before we jump into our Q&A?
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of my favorite tests is going to be the GI test. And so when you look at our gut test, 85% of your immune system comes from your gut. And we just forget how important our gut is. And so many people are shutting down their gut with proton pump inhibitors, H2 inhibitors. We don't want, they're using probiotics, but are you using the right probiotic? And unfortunately, a lot of people use the same probiotic over and over and over and over again. You have hundreds of bugs in your gut. So if you don't know which part of your gut isn't working, or which part it isn't metabolizing, or what part is not working, then you're just kind of throwing darts at the board. So I love understanding, since I'm a massive inflammatory shell. I have celiac disease, but my celiac disease was silent. So it always manifested as autoimmunity and allergies. Doing a allergy food test that, you test through the gut, that's great. Going in and doing our gut test where it shows what is the phyla and what are the families and what are the toxins, what are the pathogens in there, what are the healthy communals that maybe are too low or out of regulation. If you can get that all in balance, guess what? So much of your body will take care of itself when you push it back toward just that balance. And so that's got to be one of my favorites, is when in doubt, start with your gut.
I like that. I like that because the gut seeds so much, and I think I'm seeing some commentary from some people in the chat commenting about stress and trauma, right? Really impacting that. And we think of the gut as well founds about what 70-80% of the serotonin we're making, and it is fed by it's signaled by the brain. There's such a huge connection between heart and gut, right? Mind and gut. And so when people ask the question of where do I start with my trauma, right? A therapist needs to be there, but we also have to address what within the body is disabling you having a space to heal that trauma, right? And so I think coming in and working with a practitioner who's able to hear what trauma you need to address, hear the story of your body, and start working on healing the body so that there's space to start healing within the mind and the heart as well, right? And I think testing the gut is such an interesting way into that, because if we know it's all wackadoodle, right, that's not going to offer space that you can do some of that heart healing that you need to. So for people in the chat who are really calling out trauma, right, I'm not saying necessarily go directly to a gut test. I would really offer work with a clinician understand where this body healing needs to start, what you need to assess to start that body healing. Probably is going to start in the gut, let's be honest, but talk of the clinician to confirm. And then, that will lay groundwork and space for some of the heart healing. But I'm glad you brought that one up. Thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
and I would also add to that, if you've ever heard of the emotional code or tapping, you can rewire a lot of your traumas and neutralize them, and mitigate them. Because what happens is when we have a trauma and we have these neuropeptide cascades that go in and they basically make a recipe. So anytime you're in a similar environment or something that triggers that same memory, that neural cascade goes, well, this is just like having a chocolate milkshake. I have my chocolate milkshake of trauma.
Yeah.
And it shakes up and it pours through your body. You're like, oh my God, I'm re-experiencing it. When you do the tapping, and you can then go through and redo that milkshake so that you take the trauma out of it, all of a sudden you don't have to lose the lessons, but you maintain your ability to see and be a little more objective and less emotional. And you're like, oh, you can also do neuro linguistic programming where you can see it from the outside. I've done a lot of that where, you see it on a TV and you can feel the emotion, and all of a sudden you make it gray and black and white and maybe push it further away and you can go, oh, I can watch it, but I'm no longer traumatized by it. So there's a lot of fabulous, fabulous techniques that you can start on your own. If you've got the guidance of a practitioner, wonderful. But if not, don't feel like everyone has to have an EMDR and an emotional code and a whatever therapist. You know what?
Yeah.
You have a PhD in yourself. And a lot of this, as Justin said, what can I control? I can go to emofree.com and download a basic emo-free, and I can start working on that. And I will just take, that Coke out of my diet today. Those are in my control. Those are cost effective. Those can make a huge difference. And then you go, bravo, bravo, look what I did today, and do surround yourself with supportive team.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for calling out some of the more accessible stuff that people can do right off the bat.
Sure.
Do that. Yeah. Okay. Shall we dive into Q&A? Does that make sense right now? Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay, so this is, I guess, an indirect inflammation question. So we have Maria, who has Hashimoto's, and she's worked to dramatically reduce some of her blood work number, TPO, etc. Through a lot of, it sounds like, diet, lifestyle, etc. She's also postmenopausal on BHRT, and she's really asking the question of, given the state of autoimmune condition, and she's very successfully managing it, do we think that she can, potentially get down? What's a clinical goal for this number, this marker for her? What's an appropriate clinical goal? Can it ever get down to 0? Dr. Stuff, do you have thoughts there? And again, she has to work with a practitioner, all that fun stuff. But if you see a patient like this, would you ever counsel them that 0 is where they're going to be and get to?
I wouldn't. I would say continue to trend down, continue to feel how you feel. Let's look at other markers. The goal is not to have a 0, but I would love to get you under 100. I would love to get you down in the low 10s, but again, it's progress that is most important. And don't beat yourself up because the number isn't the right number. Numbers are arbitrary. Numbers are based on, historic data and scientific data, but not all data is accurate data. So if we can see, you feel better, you're more alert, your symptoms are abating, even if the number's still a little high. Okay, what else can we look like? Maybe there's some things, as Justin said, you can't control. Maybe you live right next to a 5G, transponder, and until you move, you're just going to have that extra stimulation. Then, okay, that's not going to change. But not everybody's going to move in the middle of the country on 100 acres and never see the city again. And so, let's just do, it's progress, not perfection.
I love that answer. I agree wholeheartedly. All right. Faye is asking a question. She read an article, and I've heard this actually a few times in the past 2 or 3 years. I read an article today that vitamin D is a rat poison. um, the guy said that the supplement actually damaged his bones. They're confused because I would imagine most people advocate for vitamin D supplementation. Um, Justin, would you like to take a go at this one?
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I would be curious as to like what brand and things that would be coming from. Usually D3 is coming from it's cholecalciferol, and it's actually coming from sheep's wool mostly. You can actually get some of it as like a mushroom extract, like there is certain mushrooms that have a little bit of vitamin D in there. Um, and it's pretty well documented at this point as far as why the body needs it. But it's important to note here, it is a hormone, right? More so than it is a micronutrient. And we have
Mhm.
a brilliant pathway that we look at. Um, I've never been, I mean, I think that the more you can obtain from the sunshine, it's really not so much a nutritive pathway as it is a hormetic pathway that you should be getting from the sun. But I'm not sure that I've ever heard that it's rat poison. I know that most of it does come from sheep's wool, which is a very interesting thing to me. That within the wool of the sheep, there's vitamin D3, activated vitamin D. Um, Ladies, do you have anything to add to that? I simply haven't heard of that before. Rat poison.
Yeah. I was never, oh, go ahead, Dr.
No, no,
Nielsen.
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say I was never really able to trace back where that actually started. To me, at least, the what my awareness of it, this was a little bit of an internet rumor. And I would offer, I think your first commenter on the quality of supplementation is really important. Where are you getting this from? Because possibly, right? Like, I, by and large, don't advise people buying supplements off Amazon for no other reason than there's a lot of counterfeits, a lot of pretend, like people say, oh, this is a reputable company and it's not, right? So there can be kind of one of those Tylenol things going on. I would also say you need to ensure that when you're taking this, again, it's a hormone, you have to take it balanced. There's a reason you take it with K2. There's a reason that it's taken within the context of a medical plan. And when not taken properly, absolutely can it hurt your bones, but you're kind of drinking gallons of it at that point in time. It's usually very high levels that by and large most people wouldn't be taking. Yeah,
Well, okay, so I'm going to put my pharmaceutical hat on here.
please.
Every substance has what we call an LD50, which is a
Beautiful.
lethal dose of 50% of the population. The lethal dose for a rodent is different than a lethal dose for a human. One, because of the mass and size, and two is because of our mechanisms and how we break things down. That's why some foods work for certain people and some foods don't work for certain people, because they can't break them down. They can't detoxify them. They can't get them out. So at high doses, vitamin D3 can be toxic for the rodent population because of the metabolic pathway. Now, it's high doses over a long period of time. It's not like warfarin, which is truly rat poison, but it is also an anticoagulant that we use in humans. So the regular D3 is not rat poison. The regular D3 is an active form that your body can absorb, the body can utilize, and it is perfectly safe. Again, I like to double check. Besides my gut feeling, besides people saying they're feeling better, I like to double check. I double check with lab tests. I do a 25 hydroxy vitamin D. But if you, it used to be back in the olden ages, they said if you were 10 or higher, you were fine. Hogwash. Now it's if you're not 30 or higher, okay? Because the only people that died of swine flu and bird flu and
Yeah.
all these back had 10s. It's not enough to fight off the pathogens. 30 to 50 will make you pretty much resistant between coughs and colds. 50 to 80 will make you far more resistant to chronic diseases. So if you, that's a number that I say to people, this is like a target. If you don't know what your target is, if you don't know where you are, then you're probably down in that 10 and you're having massive inflammation because every bug and cootie can come in and your body's constantly fighting all these invaders. But if your levels are high enough, 50, 60, 70, then great. Now, how do you know if it's too high? If you start muscle cramping because vitamin D grabs onto calcium, calcium causes a constriction of the muscles. If you start muscle cramping with high doses of vitamin D, you'll know you're too high. That's why I like my D3 with K2. And a lot of people don't get outside enough, and they don't get bright sunlight, and they don't get 90% of their body. That's why I don't like D2. D2 is an unconverted form. And so I like the active forms that you don't have to convert, that grabs the K2 and it can stuff it back in your bones if there's too much excess. It's like, if I'm going to do that, I want a double bang for my buck, so that, I saw somebody say, I can't tell you how many tests I've had. I can't tell you how many supplements I've had. But sometimes functional practitioners are just throwing supplements like symptom stomping. That's not what we do. We're looking at your function. What does your DNA say your function is likely to be? What do your blood tests say your function, the snapshot in time, appears to be? What do your symptomology appears to be? And then we overlay them all and say, here you are right here. And this is where that inflammation is likely coming from. What if we change? I can tell you, I had a client who could not get out of bed and walked in, and was holding like on a walker, and had sugar and had diet soda and I'm like, what, are you kidding me? I said, what if you gave me 30 days with none of this? I'll let you switch it to a hydration flavored water, electrolyte drink. And what if we added omega-3s and turmeric? In 30 days, she came back without a walker. In 30 days, she said, I am sleeping less. Within 90 days, she started walking. Within 180 days, she's now back at the gym and she's lost 25 pounds. Guess what? She did one thing, is she took a finite period of time, cut out a couple things, added a couple things, and just said, let's just see what happens. She felt so much better. And she said, you can't even believe the number of lives you've changed, because I tell everyone, if you're not on turmeric and omega-3s, and I'm like, well, that may not be right for everyone. She's like, well, so far it's worked. So for her, it was right.
I adore that. Yeah. In particular, that kind of discipline and dedication. Once you get a good plan, right? You have to see it through. Okay. Our next question is coming from Jill. Can you please speak to inflammation that impacts memory, as well as testing recommendations to identify causes of inflammation that lend to Alzheimer's and other dementia-related conditions? So really speaking to inflammation's impact on memory and kind of how that can bubble up into something more dire.
Yeah, I mean, neural inflammation is definitely a nasty thing to deal with. I think that a lot of airborne toxins, especially like stuff that go in through the respiratory tract and into your nose, right? Like airborne heavy metals and things like that can really gum up the works. When it comes to inflammation at the level of the brain, I think it really has to do with toxins in combination with inflammation that's causing a lot of like calcifying, right? Because that really kind of puts a kink in the hose to where you don't get as much circulation and blood flow into the brain. And it can start impacting various aspects of your cognition, right? I mean, Alzheimer's would be the kind of more severe endpoint of that. We actually have genes that are in the cardiovascular section of your DNA 360 report that also lend themselves to the Alzheimer's conversation, because it's about your body's ability to use things like cholesterol to heal endothelial inflammation. The same thing that can gum up the heart can also gum up the brain. Interestingly, they're both brains, right? There's like 40,000 neutrino cells in the heart. So it's actually intelligent in and of itself as well. But if you have things calcifying, it's going to slowly make it so that there's less and less blood flow into your brain. And that can be the start of the Alzheimer's process and really be harmful. So anti-inflammatory strategies, as well as things like blood flow strategies, are really, really useful for that. Anything that increases nitric oxide, right? So like there's nutritive approaches to that. There's things like red light therapy, anything that kills inflammation. And I'm in the general space right now, right? So like PEMF and grounding and possibly some heat exposure, some cold exposure, definitely omega-3s, definitely turmeric. Check your CYP1A2 gene for turmeric, because we need to know a little bit about that pathway before you just go adding that in. And I think curcumin would definitely be the better form of it if you are going to do a turmeric with maybe a little bit of bioprint in there. But start with that. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do directly for the brain. Like I'm in love with brain tap and nootropics and alternate nostril breathing. There's a lot we can do to improve cognition. BDNF, that matters a lot there as well. But I think it's a combination of inflammation and toxins that are causing calcification to reduce blood flow to the brain. Um, Ladies, do you have anything to add to that? There's so much going on with that particular pathway.
No, I love it. I love exactly what you said.
Oh, all right. Perfect. Top notch. I think Dr. Nielsen, this question might be for you. So Julie in our chat, she's offered a few of her genes. She says she's taking BHRT HRT as well. And she's wondering if it's a mistake. She has an estrogen dominant genomic profile. She's gained about 50 pounds in 1 year. She's 53. She has a lot of kind of the joint and the back pains that you've mentioned. And she said a lot of this started after she had her daughter at 43, which was an IVF transfer. And then she also started taking hormones, I think, slightly after that. In hindsight, she's wondering if she kind of hit perimenopause at that point. She has migraines, and so it's a lot of joint pain, a lot of migraines, a lot of just generalized unwellness on. It sounds like an HRT protocol, estrogel and progesterone. So any thoughts there as to kind of how, as our BHRT expert, how these sorts of things, especially following a birth, can lend.
So, yeah, a couple of different things that I would say here. When we look at our hormones, my number one go-to is a Dutch test. And let me tell you why. You can do saliva tests, you can do blood tests, but we don't know how you are metabolizing, especially when we look at your genes and see, okay, some of your methylation may work or it may not. With your UGTB 17, you may not have very good calcium back into the bones, and you could be setting yourself up for osteoporosis. With your CYP genes, are you metabolizing down a pathway that goes to a 4-hydroxy methyl estrone? Are you going to a 16-hydroxy? The 4-hydroxy is going to give you DNA damage, which will cause cellular inflammation. A 16-hydroxy is going to cause proliferation. So if you've got a fibroid in there and you've got a high 16, something's going to be growing and brewing. So you've got you've gotten to the door. Okay, I'm on my HRT, but where is it going? This is kind of like having sugar, flour, water, and eggs. You've got all your ingredients, but what is your end result going to be? Until we do a urine metabolite test, we don't see which pathway you're going down and what the results you're getting. If you've gained 50 pounds, I am betting that your thyroid may be a little sluggish. I'm betting that your liver's not detoxifying. I'm betting that your gut may need some support. We can tell all of that with a Dutch test. Now, we run the Dutch test and you can have a practitioner then review that with you. Or if you have, your gynecologist or whoever is prescribing your HRT, I would talk to them about a 24-hour urine metabolite or a Dutch test. Make sure they're comfortable viewing the results. Just because they can run them doesn't mean they know how to read them. And this would also look at your cortisol. So I think you have enough going on, and especially with a 50-pound gain, it's time to really take your health seriously for 2025. And let's find out what pathways are you going down so we can shift those and help you get out of those inflammatory responses, get some of that weight off, get some of that balance, and really support your HPA access.
Gorgeous. I love that. All right. The next question we have is from Nicole, and she's asking, what are the best probiotics that can be taken to calm down inflammation in the intestine?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a few that are on our Gut 360 test, right? Like lactobacillus, and it's really any of these probiotic strains that are what's called a short chain fatty acid producer. It helps a lot with dealing with the inflammation. Adding, once again, a process of deletion and then addition is something to be aware of with this pathway for sure, because there are so many things that can cause inflammation at the level of the gut. I really think that doing some sort of mucosal barrier assessment is usually a good idea. Even looking for like liver congestion, right, with like urinary bile acids and things may be of use, because there's a really good relationship there between all of those systems. If you have leaky gut, which is not the actual term, it's actually mucosal layer permeability, hyperpermeability, right?
Yep.
But if that's present, you're going to get a lot more of these pathogenic species kind of working their way in there. They're what's called opportunistic. So they have the opportunity to get in there, and they do. And once they've taken root, it's really hard for these beneficial species to actually like take root as well. So I'm just saying that because the addition of a positive species may not be enough if there's already pathogenic species in there, because they kind of bully it, so to speak. So our gut 360 is something I'd recommend, because it shows you your levels of this bifidobacterium, Saccharomyces, right? All of these short chain fatty acid producers. If you don't have enough of those, it may be in your interest to add something that has those in there. But there's so much other things that can be going on, right? There's these biofilms. You could have that, like too many of those. You could have pathogenic species, E. coli, candida, yeast overgrowth. So it's a really big picture with all that. But I would recommend doing some sort of a gut test. Even the food sensitivity that Dr. Nielsen talked about can be really beneficial there. You may need to take a little something to shore up that mucosal layer, but those would be the species I would look at. Dr. Nielsen, you may be itching to add something to that. I'm not sure, because you're such an expert with this.
Well, the thing that I'll tell you is, don't get a probiotic that only has a single species. Don't get just a lactobacillus, get something that has 4, 5, 6, 8. Go through that bottle and then get a new bottle that has different species. I'm starting to see out there, like in the over-the-counter world, that they'll say, species that will affect your sinuses, your mouth flora, your gut. In the case of a woman, female health, rectal health, in the case of a guy, it'll go in and help with prostate health. That top to bottom, when you've got 7 or 8 species, I also want you to go out and learn. Don't just accept. There are probiotic foods, fermented foods that you can ferment at home. Let's just take sauerkraut, for example. You take a little bit of cabbage and you slice it up and you do some salt and you put like a small little plate over it and then a cheesecloth, and it sits on your counter for a week. And guess what? It starts to ferment. It starts to bubble. Now that's called wild fermentation. And you're going to get hundreds of microbes out of your environment in there that will be very beneficial for the gut. So I'm really big on probiotic rotation, top to bottom. And you will notice when you feel one at the end of a bottle, you're like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. Then maybe repeat that bottle. If not, rotate until you get that aha.
Yeah. I love that you brought in diet to that, because by and large, unless there's like a very focused medical need, or like I've just been on antibiotics, like a very purposeful, my solutions tend to really sit within diet, both those probiotics, but then also thinking prebiotics, right? The things that actually feed your gut, because it's one thing to put those buggies in there, but if you're not feeding them and making them feel welcome, they're going to be like, bye, and they're going to leave. So be careful with prebiotics. You don't necessarily want to be feeding the bad guys, but you want to make sure you're offering an environment to the bacteria there that they're going to be fed and want to stay. And that's by and large our fibers and our, those are the things that feed them. Yeah, I love that. I love that tag team answer there. Okay. Nicole had another question as well. What is the best way, and we've indirectly addressed this a little bit, what is the best way to deal with inflammation due to stress? Everyone's favorite sin, the sin of stress.
Yeah. And where to take this one, right? Because like stress can be eating the wrong foods, right? Stress can be a lot of things. There's all kinds of cultural and social elements to that. One of the best pieces of advice I ever heard with regard to stress was actually from our friend Dr. Patrick Porter. He talked about kind of the way that you view things. And I'm a really big proponent of this. So he said that if you view things as challenges rather than threats, you really reduce your moment by moment stress load by quite a bit. Now, your stress, again, can be coming from so many different things. It's the totality of it. So we need to make sure you're eating the right foods, that you're exercising the right way, you're in alignment with your assignment, I like to call it, as far as living in concordance with your DNA. That's one of my little sayings. So that's a good place to start. But again, if in your mind you view everything as a threat, and that's a threat, and that's a threat, you're kicking on the reticular activating system, and you're causing an HPA axis response, and your body's just pumping out cortisol and epinephrine, and that can easily compromise your gut. That can cause cortisol dominance, and there's a lot of issues that come with that as well. You get all kinds of, not adrenal fatigue, we've talked about this before, but HPA axis dysregulation, and that's a problem. So if you take that same problem and you say, this is a challenge, you don't call it a stress or a threat, you call it a challenge, just that mindset alone, if you can make that your default, you'll reduce your stress by probably 50%, just right there, so that's one of the best pieces of advice I've seen. Ladies, anything to add to that? There's so many different ways to reduce, cortisol, stress, etc.
Well, so I love two things. With one, I love to reframe and say, worrying is just praying for disaster. Okay. So, oh, I'm so worried that they won't show up. Oh, I'm so worried they won't be happy. I'm so worried. Well, what if you just changed it and go, so what if they don't show up? Is it the end of my world? What next? What's the worst thing that would happen if they don't show up? Nothing. Well, then why are you spending any of your precious time on it? What happens if they don't like your meal? Okay, it's one meal in their life. They'll get over it. You know what? You can say sorry. If you are doing your best, if you are putting concerted effort in, if you are, if you're spending all this time and all this what if, rather than what is, then you're not being fully present. Get out and walk, move. When you move, people think, oh, I don't have enough energy to exercise. But when you get out and move, you have so much more energy because you burn off all that extra stuff. And you can reduce your stress load by really playing the what's the worst thing that would happen? What's the worst thing that would happen? What's the worst thing that would happen? Until you get to the point and you go, nothing, it just is. Well, then knock it off. And if you go, am I giving it my best? Have I done all I can do? Am I being truthful, honest, and in integrity? Then if they have a hissy fit, that's on them. That's not about you. So part of it's reframing, part of it's listening to positive stuff. Part of it is just going, what is in my control? What is out of my control? And what am I going to do about it? And then, you got to go, enough. Now, from a clinical point of view, measure your cortisol. See where your cortisol is, or get one of the little rings or one of the fitness. Is your pulse high? Is your pulse ox? Are you keeping oxygenated? Are you breathing through your mouth? Are you doing breath work? People say, go meditate. Well, I was horrific at meditating until I realized I didn't have to sit still and go, you can meditate when you walk. You can listen to a guided meditation. Meditation is sitting at a lake and just hearing the sounds around you. You can listen to gentle music. If you get yourself where you shut your eyes and calm down and listen to just that zone where it's like, it feels like eternity lasts on, you're in a meditative state, and that will lower your stress level. It will lower your cortisol. If you want something, to put in your mouth, get some ashwagandha, get some rhodiola, get some adaptogens that will take the stress off that adrenal complex and give yourself. I love withenia, which is also ashwagandha, but withenia is the curcumin as opposed to turmeric. Withenia is from the ashwagandha. I'll tell you what, I call that a wellness happy pill. People will say, I still have all this stuff going on, but I don't give a shit and I can get through it. I'm a big ashwagandha fan. So especially with people who just feel so out of control, all of a sudden a cup of green tea and some ashwagandha, and they're like, okay, I got this. So there's lots you can do to control your environment with stress.
Yeah. I like that. I like that in particular, that last thought of stopping and then doing something, because I think sometimes if you're stressed, you don't want to. The solution shouldn't always be think yourself out of it. I think sometimes, like we've talked already about tapping, right? There's an element of interrupt it, and then there's an element of do something different with your body,
Mhm.
right? There's a few books that will say, like, if you find yourself lost in a mental spinning, right? Stop and clean your house for 5 minutes,
Yeah.
or stop and do tapping for 5 minutes. It's this idea of stop the pattern, and then maybe instead, think, or different to that, maybe get out of your brain and into your body, and that will shift it. That will give your body a moment to realize, oh, that actually was not a physical threat. It was just something in my mind. Yeah.
I'll tell you, when I do my taxes, I get super stressed out. Oh, am I doing them wrong? Oh, I've done this, I've done that. I can only work for like 30 minutes, and then I'm like pitting. I have this massive perspiration, and I have to get up and I have to go do some laundry, and then
Yeah.
I come back in and I look at it and I go, what was I so wicked about? All of that is fine,
Yeah.
but I have to disrupt
Yeah.
my disruption. So two negatives make a positive. So when you get up and move around and recreate, or get a new glass of
Yeah.
iced tea or something, then
Interrupt.
and I love that Amanda said ashwagandha for the win.
You found kin here.
Yeah.
All right. Vicky has a question for us. So Vicky is saying her husband has a lot of inflammation, arthritis in the back, in addition to stenosis, and his joints ached. They have done all the wonderful things insofar as they've cleaned up diet, cleaned up air, cleaned up exercise and sleep. So kind of all those happy things that we've mentioned. What is next? What is next to kind of address, it sounds like, some of the pain that is going on there?
Interesting. So you've done the general part, and now it's time for the
Mhm.
specific part, like we talked
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
I don't know, Vicky, if he has his DNA 360, that would be a great place to start as far as identifying where some of these inflammatory factors might be.
Mhm.
Because your genes are a default setting, and if your body, let's say, doesn't glutathionize properly, we can extrapolate a little bit and say these are the various areas that might require a little bit of support. Without knowing the man, I can assume that he has some sort of defect within his genes, as we all do. I've never
Mhm.
seen someone who has ideal genes across the board. I've never seen somebody who's suboptimal across the board either, right?
Yeah.
We've all got some superpowers and we've all got some detriments within that, but it could be anywhere in there, right? I mean, maybe it's mitochondrial detox, maybe it's methylation, maybe it's vitamin D. You're going to need to know where those weak points are in order to have something to kind of work backwards from.
Mhm.
But if you don't have that available right now, what I would say is definitely get some grounding in there, right? Justin doesn't shut up about grounding. I'm a big fan of things like PEMF, like I mentioned earlier in the call. I'm a big fan of heat exposure. I'm a big fan of cold exposure. Everything eats, right? So you do have to start with things like the diet. We all move, so we got to understand how to move and how to do it in a restorative capacity. Um, I think that really it would be just those kind of grounding techniques and really starting there if you don't have his DNA
Mhm.
360. But if you do, by all means, look at the weak points and then add in some interventions or get them set up with me and I'll add in some interventions. But we need to know where the weak points are in the first place, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'd also offer, I think, like, it sounds like this person's been worked up at least by a doctor to kind of get to those end diagnosis. I'd want to investigate lifestyle. So for some of this joint pain, is that a unique problem, or is that more because you have to adjust movements because of the backs, you're overusing some joints that weren't necessarily meant to be used. So I'd really want that physical assessment to figure out life patterns. Are they impacting joints? And then if they're not, maybe looking into some blood work to really pinpoint what is then causing that. Is that secondary to autoimmune, to virus, to this, to that? I think eliminating other things that, the back pain may be distracting to what's actually going on outside of that. And so I think once especially that physical workup has been done, possibly working with the doctor. Dr. Nielsen, I see you twisting a little bit. There's a thought. That thought is trying to jump out and the body is letting us know. Let's hear it, girl.
Definitely, I do PEMF. Anytime you have stenosis or narrowing, I think of calcium overload. You could have a calcium shell where you're getting almost crusting.
Mm.
I really like the idea of stretching, and I would look at your fascia. So fascia
Ooh,
can
yes.
be, there's a over-the-counter thing called fascia blasting or dry rubbing, where you get in and you move the tissues. But again, what I hear here, and I could be wrong, joint aches, stenosis, inflammation, I'm hearing a lot of calcium, and I'm betting there's a calcium overload and an imbalance with vitamin D, calcium. And so you're getting all that layering, and calcium is hard and it's crystally and it's chunky and it hurts. So I would look at an HTMA mineral analysis. I would do the PEMF. I would look at some stretching. I would look at fibrosis and the fascia and cleaning up that fascia.
Yeah, foam rolling, you can
Mhm.
get the little massage guns. There's a lot of ways to really break up that tissue in there. Deep tissue massage is really useful. Making sure the joints are in alignment in the first place. I know a lot of people kind of poo-poo the idea of chiropractors. I definitely think there's a way not to do that. I think that it can be overdone. I think my personal experience is there is a place for realignments now and again, but you do need to have it as a baseline of stretching and foam rolling, and inversion tables are great. Hanging is great. I hang from the barbell to really just keep things in alignment. But definitely get some of that deep tissue work. I mean, we can just biohack the shit out of it if we need to with compression and laser lights, and there's all kinds of things that you can do from there. CBD and topical oils and peptides, and we can really go deep into the weeds. My point was just knowing where the weak areas are first in the genes in case there's something to identify there. But yeah, I mean, body work should be a relative constant for most of us, I think, at this point, because we sit too much, and there's tightening up of hip flexors, etc. So let's biohack it if we can.
So Vicky says her husband does have his DNA test, and maybe he'll reach out to you, Justin, because it sounds like you're ready to hack away and get
I'm
rid of all
ready
that
right now.
stenosis.
Let's do it.
I know the team has talked about this, but I'm going to call them on it to make sure it happens. We've kind of
Okay.
had this conversation at the end of 2024. We want to have a reel of all of Justin isms and biohack the shit out of it. It needs to be on that reel. So the team, if you're listening, that needs to be clipped. That needs to be put on the reel.
I
And
can
I'm
hardly
expecting the
wait for
reel by
that
the
one.
end of the year.
That is my motto, really. Like, someone comes to me, I'm just like, let's biohack the shit out of that problem right now.
Oh, Monsieur, this makes me so happy. Okay. Um, mm, let's see. Julia's asking, or sorry, what can I do to stem? Okay, so Janice, I apologize. Janice is asking, what can you do to stem, or I would imagine to thwart, reduce, to support, to address candida? So there's a little bit, she has a bit of a candida overgrowth. So why don't we talk a little bit what that is, and then what can be done to help that out?
Oh, I'll give a couple thoughts on that, and then I'll pass the microphone here. But I do think that, like I mentioned, when we talk about these opportunistic species, usually there can be some sort of mucosal barrier issue there that it kind of stemmed from. We see it really often with people that have two copies of GSTM1, and we see this over aggressive glutathionizing, um, to where your body like reacts, and it just kind of identifies things as enemies, and it recognizes, that's an enemy, and it kicks on like a detox response, and a whole lifetime of that. Once again, we lived ourselves into this situation, and we'll live our way out of it as well. But it tends to lend itself to this weakening of that mucosal barrier. And then the opportunistic species like Candida can get their way in there and kind of take root. We see that a lot with antibiotic use as well. There's a lot of things that can lead to too much yeast, too much Candida, etc. I think that it's sort of a step-by-step thing that you may want to do. Once again, just adding in a lactobacillus or something like that probably won't be sufficient in and of itself. There's a lot of moving parts to gut health, right? There's hydrochloric acid to consider. There's digestive enzymes, proteolytic enzymes, and things to consider. Then there's the opportunistic species. You may need some sort of a binder in there. You may need something like a silver, like something to really get some of those bad species out of there and then add in the beneficial species. I'm a fan of things like colostrum. I'm a fan of things like bone broth and glutamine and some peptides even. I'm not allowed to officially recommend them, but BPC 157 is very useful for, according to the research, for restoring the gut wall. So it could be a multifaceted approach, but I do think that once again, using the DNA 360 is great because you can see if it's only Candida, maybe it's Candida and E. coli, right? Maybe there's kind of a team of bad guys in there that we need to tackle. Dr. Nielsen, I'm sure you're itching to add to that. What do you think?
So I had horrific Candida. It's an old book, but I would get the Candida diet, which is going to be basically an elimination diet. I spent 2 years on nothing but protein and greens, no condiments, nothing else. I had, spinach and eggs for breakfast. I'd have chicken and lettuce for lunch. I'd have beef and broccoli for dinner. In addition to that, I took cat's claw. I took Pau d'Arco. I did a series of rotation of antiparasitics and antifungals. None of them were any of the traditional pharmaceutical ones. I did all herbal. And so I did black walnut shell and a bunch of different things. And if you rotate those, you restrict sugars because sugar and starches, I'd go on a super low carb diet. That will cause the die-off. Now, when you have die-off, you can have a reaction where you feel worse rather than better. And you've got to get past 4 days of no sugar, because that 4th day, those bugs are screaming so hard. You're like, I have got to have a piece of chocolate, But if you can get past that 4th day when they're dying off, then man, do you feel better. So I have flirted my whole life with Candida because they didn't know I was celiac, and I was always stuffy and I was always itchy and I was always, I had as many rounds of antibiotics as I would have a female cycle. I'd have 2 weeks of getting well, 2 weeks of being sick, a round of antibiotics, 2 weeks of stability, and then 2 weeks of getting sick again, a round of antibiotics. It was like I'd have 8 or 9 rounds of antibiotics. I will never, ever, ever be able to have all the Candida out of my body, but I'm able to put it down to such a low level through a low carb diet that I no longer have those uncontrollable cravings. And now I do some gut testing to check my levels of Candida. And, when I get near the holidays or when I get a little lazy and I'm like, oh, it's okay, I'm so good, then they will bloom and they slap me back down and say, girl, this is a lifetime thing, knock it off. But, a lot of our health journey is going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's just like a cha-cha, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that's okay because you're human, and because you don't want to miss, you don't want to be at your kid's wedding and miss out on, a celebratory drink or a celebratory whatever. So do as much as you can do, be okay with that, and then do more, and be okay with that, and then do more. It's all step by step. And when people say, I don't know how you handled cancer at 21, and I'm like, it was the best thing that ever happened to me because it set me on a true health path. I wouldn't probably have any of this that I have now if I had not had that adversity. But now when I did my breast 360 and it showed inflammation, it was clinically significant. I was like, hell no, we're not having that. That bitch is out the door. I'm taking care of that. And I went on an instant anti-inflammatory, clean the diet up, get on some more supplements, get my DIM going, and all of that kind of thing. So, occasionally you just have to go. I need to be a little more disciplined. I need to be, because your purpose has to be bigger than your problem. Oh, I can't eat X. Well, you know what? Nothing tastes as good as feeling good feels. I am 61. I get compared to late 40s, early 50s all the time. I run circles around these 20 and 30-year-old kids at school. I mean, I'm as old as their moms, and some of them I'm as old as their grandma, and they look at me and they see me as a peer. Why? Because I give a shit, and because I try, and because they know that I'm a trusted resource for them. And because there's nothing I ask them to do that I wouldn't do myself. So when they're all having stomach pains and they have their double latte chocolatey blah, 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 and then at the end of the day, they're doubling over and I'm handing out digestive enzymes, and they're like, oh, thank you, and they're like, I really need to clean it up. I'm like, you really do, you know. So if I work weekends with them, I bring lunch in for everybody and I will cook it and then bring it in. And they're like, this is so good. I didn't know. I'm like, it's a crock pot. It's like throw a bunch of stuff in there and let it go. But it's
The
just,
auntie
they
we all
don't know what
want.
they don't know. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the
Just
auntie
be
we all
all
want.
in. Be all in or get out and quit complaining.
There we are. There you have
There
it. Yeah, and with Candida, that's kind of unfortunately what you have to be. It sucks,
is.
but yeah, that advice sucks, but here it is. Lori is asking, is the de-aging test a Dunduden, I can never say this, Dunduden pace test? And how often should we do the test to monitor? So yes, de-aging will report on that score. It also reports on telomere length, but to be plain, really, you're looking for the Dunduden pace because that's more where medical standard sits. And so it depends on what intervention you're offering or what you're doing. You can retest as quickly as 3 months. Most people I'm usually suggesting though between 6 and 12 because plainly unless it's a really marked dramatic change, it's usually at the 6 month mark that you're gonna have something meaningful. And yeah, I hope that answered that question there. Next question is what type of practitioner would be able to guide um, some trauma work via PTSD and other chronic pain, etc. There's going to be a variety of practitioners. I think there's an element of what might resonate with you. We've kind of talked about sometimes talk therapy is most appropriate for people. Sometimes other people need to do body work. Sometimes other people need to address something physical before they can kind of get into that. I don't mean to offer that as a general answer, but I would say finding a practitioner that resonates with you, right? That's really, really important. And then understanding where your current state of health is, right? If there's something physically going on, sometimes addressing that's going to be really important. And then for the other practitioners, I would always look for someone who's registered by a licensed body, who's done that clinical oversight training, right? And then really looking at, what other skills have they acquired over their life? Have they learned body work? Have they learned this? And really ensuring that aligns with the type of work that you want. I think like Dr. Steph mentioned with meditation, right? There's many, many, many different forms of meditation, right? And not all forms are going to be good for all people. Okay. And so really, looking at different practitioners, you can Google it, look at their website, and really understand what sort of apart from their licensing, what else have they explored? Where else are they focusing their modalities around? And so, yeah. Anyone else kind of with thoughts there as to what practitioner might be appropriate?
I will say we do have a program called Precision, which is
Mm,
it's a high level program because you're just calling the super friends, like you're literally getting a team of practitioners. Excuse me. So
Yeah.
if it's really debilitating and you're just at that point, I mean, we have psychiatrists, there's so many great practitioners that
mm,
we work with, and we would specify, right? We would find the ones that are going to work best for you, and you'd end up with kind of a team behind you for a pretty long standing program. And we can talk about inflammation. We can use your genes. We can use it all, mindset, tactics, and just this
mhm.
combination of a lot of cool little therapies in there. So that would be one thing I would recommend because, to Dr. K's point there, more than one is most likely going to be necessary because you're dealing with a couple of different moving elements there.
Mm, mm, mm. Teamwork makes the dream work. I don't have fun phrases like Justin, but I'll borrow from other people.
That's a good one. Hey.
Teamwork makes the dream. I appreciate the participation ribbon I just got there. I'll take it. That was all the athletic accolade I got as a child, participation ribbons. All right, Cindy is asking a question. Um, oh, I like this question actually, because I think it's a very honest question. Can something as simple as a diet high in starches or very high in sugars be causing my inflammation and joint pain? Her Amy one is AA. Look at Steph's face. Steph's face answers your question. All right, so I think Steph, maybe do you want to jump into this, like almost to a degree independent of the gene presentation? I think gene presentations, when it comes to sugar, really influence the question of how quickly you're going to see impact, not necessarily will you see impact. Anyone's diet who is high in sugar, to an extent independent of your genes, you're eventually going to see impact. So, Steph, why don't you explain your face?
Well, so a starch is a string of sugars. And so high starch diets end up contributing to out of control blood sugar. And the blood sugar then gets captured by the insulin and gets stored away as fat, and it creates all sorts of inflammatory markers. So high starch diets absolutely have massive amounts of pain. Now, one of the things, whether you look at a low carb diet, whether you look at a ketogenic diet, whether you look at, right now, carnivore is real popular. Maybe you do a short-term 30 or 60-day elimination diet. And that elimination diet means take out all of those high starchy foods, the potatoes, the rices, the breads, whatever. And if you got down to just meat and greens, or if you got down to, again, like an animal-based diet, even for 30 days, and see, do I feel different? I can tell you, I've taken clients who've lost 10 pounds in a month when they haven't been able to lose anything because they cut the starches out. Starches literally equal inflammation. So be very, very careful. And I'm an Amy one, I'm an AA, it's like I can, taste it, but that's poor starch metabolism. And then all that stuff sitting around, your body will just pack it away in the weight and in the inflammation.
Yeah, I think too that like not all starches are created equal either.
True.
Right? Like the $2 bag of Wonder Bread is, can you call it food? I mean, you could eat it and survive because there's calories, but it's like that versus some, organic jasmine rice that you cooked and cooled and you cooked it in bone broth and you added ginger in there. And you know what I mean? Like there's a really big difference between the digestibility of some of these things. So starches in and of themselves are a category, but within that category, there's a quality conversation there as well.
Sure.
Right. So like if I have a patient who, let's say, has really suboptimal gut detox, but they have really optimal AMI1 and optimal TCF7L2, where there's probably some room for starch inclusion there post workout or whatever, or if they're an athlete and they just need a certain amount of carbohydrates to get that performance, I never tell them to eat crappy starches, right? Because we want to maintain a certain level of gut health, right? So there's ways to improve your carbohydrate and your starch metabolism as well, and turn it into a resistant starch with cooling, and the quality of it. White rice tends to be less on the plant toxin side of things. Dr. Stephanie just mentioned carnivore. That's a big topic nowadays. So it's just they're not all created equal, right? So starch is the quality of it, a protein, a fat, and anything. Get the best quality of it. That's usually my first kind of baseline general advice.
Yeah. And Cindy even mentioned, some people, you do need some carbs. Absolutely. And she sleeps better when she has some carbs in her diet. That's why I said that the carnivore is a great 30 to 60-day elimination if you're trying to knock inflammation down. Then if you stay on low carb with the high quality carbs of resistant starches in smaller quantities, you can definitely add those back. But if you're trying to do knock inflammation down and just nail it, I'll tell you, a 30 to 60-day carnivore, you'd be amazed at how much inflammation you can knock down with that. And, don't even call it carnivore, just call it an elimination diet. You eliminate a lot of things that can cause the inflammation.
I think it's important in these conversations not to toss the baby with the bathwater, right? Like originally starches were mainly found within our plants and our vegetables, and those were always eaten with fiber and a lot of other things, right? It's really more this past 100-year advent of fast food where you're just eating starches where they become problematic. And so I think diets like carnivore, that trial, that elimination period is important because it's more addressing a systemic food issue as opposed to starches per se being the horrible thing. Okay. Janice is asking the question of what about red light therapy for vitamin D? Um, someone wanna, I see Justin's head moving. Justin has the mic.
Yeah. Yeah. So red light therapy is not going to provide adequate amounts of vitamin D in the body. It's useful for all kind of shit. Like I love red light therapy. You know, I live in Canada. It's winter. I can turn the sunshine on with a button right now with the red light therapy device, and that's great. There's a lot of healing wavelengths in the red and near infrared and far infrared, but it's predominantly the UV component that actually gives you the vitamin D or causes your body to create it rather. And the red light therapy devices are independent of UV for the most part, right? Because UV is a hormetic stressor as well. We got to be aware of that. But the actual wavelengths in a red light therapy device have been isolated for really specific healing properties. And that's why there's red and infrared and far infrared, near infrared. They all penetrate the skin at different like depths. So some of them are better for the more superficial aspects, the collagen and what have you. And some of them get the more deeper healing because of the wavelength. But usually a device is not going to have any UV. And that is actually where a lot of the vitamin D creation comes from. So supplement and get actual sunshine as well.
Perfect.
Well, and there are some vitamin D lights that you can actually get that literally will produce, and it's Sol something. I'm going to say Solgar isn't right, but it's Sol something. They're expensive. They're $500 to $1,000 for this, and you spend 15 minutes. But you can get vitamin D, especially if you live in a northern area. And you want to but they're very specific light structures, and that kind of restricted. So
I like that variety of answer. All right, we have one question from Dirk, and it kind of dovetails off the last. And so, Justin, you mentioned, so Dirk is saying, can you recommend a vegan or a plant-based form of vitamin D for me specifically? Because he doesn't want to eat bushels of mushrooms every day to get the required dosage. That's a very endearing thought. Bushels of mushrooms, I like it.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, it's really hard to eat your way into clinical doses of anything, let
Mhm.
alone vitamin D. And
from
mushrooms are
plants.
also, yeah, mushrooms, they kind of react to their environment and they can actually store a lot of different things like toxins. So you have to be careful sourcing mushrooms. You got to make sure that they came from a proper source. And I don't recommend just giving her with that. And also, not all forms of mushrooms have the vitamin D. I think there's a few that
Mhm.
do, the shiitake, and there's a couple different ones. Um, so I'm a Primal health coach, and Primal has a line of supplements as well. I'm not here selling it. I'm just saying their vitamin D, some of it is extracted from mushrooms. That's actually where part of their, I think it's called Primal Sun is the product. Um, that's the only one I'm aware of that actually uses mushroom encapsulation to get some of the vitamin D. Most of it is coming from the sheep's wool, like I mentioned, and it's all D3, which is activated. What I would recommend as well, Dirk, is paying attention to nitric oxide. I think that's a really important element when it comes to using your body's own internal production of vitamin D. Nitric oxide releases it from the adipose tissue, right? So you can actually get it into circulation where it's useful. K2 is definitely very useful. Magnesium is a cofactor there, so make sure you're getting a source of that. There's plenty of plant sources, but that's the only like brand I'm aware of. Dr. K, do you have any other brand that you're aware of?
I do.
Oh,
You ever?
So
perfect.
Garden
Because
of
mine's
Life,
Canadian.
My Kind Organics, they actually have, and it comes from 10 different mushroom extracts.
Mm.
There's also a brand called SR, and they do a lichen vitamin D3, and then their
Mhm.
menaquinone comes from chickpea.
Hmm.
So, and they're in a extra virgin olive oil, so it's kind of an MCT oil kind of thing. So, I think if you put in, if you would Google something like, I think it was on best reviews, like best vegan vitamin D, you might be able to find a
Mhm.
few that have been actually looked at. But I
Yeah.
like the idea of the mushroom, and I like the idea of the lichen for someone who doesn't want to do plant source,
Yeah. Dirk,
or
there's
I
a
mean, animal source.
yeah, I think Dirk's calling in from somewhere within Europe, and I know there's a company in the UK that does a lot of plant-based omegas and vitamin Ds. So if you kind of Google that combination of omegas and vitamin Ds, you'll probably find that UK company, which might be accessible as well to you. Oakley dokley. All right, friends, I think we've come to the end of our time together. I'm seeing smiles, so I'm seeing that as confirmation. To everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us this evening. We hope we offered what you needed in terms of clarifying what the glory of inflammation is, and hopefully seeded a few strategies, hopefully seeded that idea of just start doing something. Justin, Steph, thank you so very much for joining me here this morning. It's always a delight, and I learned so much from the both of you. And so I think that's it. I'm going to dance our way out because dancing is the best form of exercise to support happiness. And so we dance out. All right. Au revoir, mes amis.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night. God bless. Happy holidays.
Oh, yeah, that too. Happy
Oh,
holidays.
yeah.
Oh, and remember, go get your tests.
Oh, yeah, that
50%
too.
off.
Fancy white tea test.